This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
First of all, Jill, thank you very much for organizing this and the opportunity to talk about this. I'm going to set out very briefly some thoughts about how scholars within the field of politics are trying to get to grips with some of the challenges we're currently being faced in relation to the political economy of austerity. My background is equal opportunities in the EU, and so I'm actually going to, because it is a European network, or I should have a European dimension, what I'm going to start to do is actually look at what are the challenges that we're being faced with in relation to the EU's position as a gender actor within the context of austerity. And the argument that I'm going to make is that within this framework, austerity provides a legitimizing force, in inverted commas, for retrenchments of some of the hard-fought rights that the Democrats have campaigned for and have actually managed to consolidate at the European level since the signing of the Treaties of Rome in 1957. So gender equality, and particularly the position of working mothers, becomes expendable within this broader context, because it's seen as, and I guess that's my conclusions that I will come to in the end, is that it's seen as collateral damage. And this is something that we need to take notice, and it is very important because it will establish the kind of discourses that, and the frameworks, the policy frameworks we're going to have to deal with for years to come. So in terms of my paper itself, I am going to start from, I'm going to use Charlotte Hooper's framework for analysis, in which she argues that state and politics are not a mere reflection of dominant masculinities or hegemonic masculinities, but actually help to construct and consolidate power and power relations. Now, scholars of politics, international relations, European public policy have been concerned or preoccupied with the issue of power and the state since the beginning of the discipline. And a number of scholars within the feminist tradition have tried to highlight the deeply gender nature of the state as an actor, but also the deeply ideological position of the state as a gender actor. Many mainstream scholars seem to approach the issue of ideologies in a very traditional way and dismiss the concept of gender ideologies. However, I would argue that the position of the coalition, and certainly the Conservative government in this country, with the focus on the big society, for instance, highlights a very specific dominant gender ideologies, which is actually based on a consolidation of traditional divisions within the family. So if we take the big society as a starting point, we all may welcome, or not, a greater involvement of civil society in everyday lives. However, someone has to be available to carry out those functions, particularly when we talk about care functions, and not just care for children, but also care for the elderly, for the disabled. So the politics of austerity, which has become pervasive across Europe, and certainly in the last week we've seen, is having huge repercussions in terms of potentially bringing to an end the conservative moment that everybody has talked about in the case of France, or perhaps bringing back an increasing rise of the far right, as we have seen in Greece, is providing very significant challenges to both policymakers at the national and European level. But what is pervasive with austerity is the language of exceptionalism. And this provides a justification for an ideology that is driven by cuts. So like many who have argued that the cuts that the coalition government has proposed were not just based on economics, but are deeply ideological. So is austerity measures. Now, employment rights, welfare, become secondary to higher economic and political imperatives. And this actually will crystallize, I would argue, in the long term, the distinction between high and low politics. And other great preoccupations of my mainstream, or to use Gillian Young's context, mainstream colleagues. The focus on high politics, i.e., in other words, power as traditional power as asserted by the state, at the expense of lower politics, i.e., social policy, gender, is become entrenched within many of the policies that austerity has enabled many governments to introduce. So what about mothering and political discourse? In the context of politics, I think it's fair to say that many mainstream scholars don't see mothering as a particularly political or politicized issue, in as far as it relates to the private. However, scholars such as Cynthia Enloe have drawn out, have argued now for a number of years, and many of us have picked up on that and consolidated these arguments, that the personal is not just political, but is certainly international. And with the role of the European Union in promoting equal rights and equal opportunities, a reconciliation agenda in more recent years, we're really seeing this kind of shift and cross-fertilization between the international, the domestic, and the private. So when we talk about mothering within the disciplinary boundaries of politics, I have to say it's not easy. And the main criticism that I receive from some colleagues outside of feminist circles, I guess, is what does it have to do, with government? Well, certainly we know that women are less represented in government, and one of the reasons why many women cite for choosing not to go into formal politics, particularly Westminster politics, national politics, and European politics, is the inability to reconcile political life and mothering. Which is also why we know that women tend to participate more readily in local politics. The closer the political setting or political sphere is to the domestic, to the private, to actually the issue of care, the more likely women are to participate. However, working mothers is an issue or a category that does preoccupy scholars. And that's because there is both an economic dimension and a social dimension. The economic dimension relates to the arguments that many gender scholars have put forward in recent years about the cost of non-equality. So in relations to changing demographic trends and the demographic time bomb in Europe, it would be foolish or foolhardy for policymakers not to make best use of women as part of the labor force, because it is about wasted skills. This has been a very, very powerful argument, and one of the main drivers for the inclusion of equality policies at the European level. I will come back to this later on in the paper, because actually it's a double-edged sword. It's a double-edged sword in as far as when the economic situation changes, or the climate, the political climate changes, as we're facing now with austerity, then it can also become victim to the kind of economic rationale. So we're buying into a neoliberal discourse which underpins most European integration theory and European integration as a process. The second one is the social dimension, which I think probably is more pertinent to sociology and psychology, and has the biggest contributions have come from those two disciplines. It relates to the impact of working mothers traditionally on the well-being of children, the family, etc. So what we're saying is that gender ideologies are deeply entrenched within the very fabric of the state. And that is something that many scholars mainstream scholars don't want to acknowledge. However, it is not just underpins the state, it actually shapes state policies, particularly in relations to welfare. So what are the assumptions that underpin current debates? The only other thing that I want to say is that when I'm going to work out this paper in more detail, I do want to use the context or the framework, the theoretical framework of the Mother War to actually unpack some of the issues that are emerging. Not necessarily the Mother War as Jim Buxton defined it, i.e. the war between working mothers, stay-at-home mothers, supermoms, etc., but actually the war of the state against mothers in a way, and particularly working mothers, and the constant use of the state of women's unpaid work. So the question in terms of public debates about mothers, I would argue, is that can women have it all, has been the driver. And I think we need to actually add to that, can women have it all in the context of austerity? And perhaps what is preoccupying policymakers at the national and European level even more is, can we afford equality, and particularly wide-reaching equal opportunity policies, reconciliation between work and family life, so on and so forth, in the context of austerity? Can we afford it? Is it viable? However, those kind of debates are based on entrenched gender ideologies, which we're all familiar with, i.e. that women are and should be the primary carers, participation in the labour market is something new, motherhood and mothering is quite innate, and socioeconomic structures are unchangeable. I would argue that these are ideological standpoints, and as such are normative and actually define policies, and we need to unpack those kind of ideological frameworks in order to understand the gender bias within the state itself. So I guess looking at mothering in politics helps us to uncover some of the very bias at the core of the disciplines and the core actors or key conceptual frameworks that are at the heart of the discipline. So for the European context, again, the question is, what is the impact of the austerity and the euro crisis on the European equality agenda? What we do know is that since enlargement, the European Union has slowed down its activities in terms of promoting an active agenda for equality. We have shifted from hard laws, which are legally binding upon the member states, to soft policy measures, which, although they indicate a policy principle and a statement of commitment, again, they can fall short of a reality in the context of higher economic and political priorities. And this is also quite problematic when the focus of EU policies has traditionally been women's activation. The framework for the inclusion of equality between men and women at European level was equal pay. Not because the founding fathers were great feminists, far from it, but because France had already introduced equal pay legislation, and the member states, France in particular, was concerned about social dumping in terms of textile industries, with workers moving, or companies moving, relocating to Italy, where labour would have been cheaper. So the focus has been on activation, and that's very much core of the Lisbon agenda, which sets out 60% female employment by, and I know I should have checked this, 2012 I think, and in order to achieve that, the Lisbon targets set out an increase in childcare provision. So this is aimed at, this feeds into Jane Lewis's articulation and analysis of the shift in terms of welfare regime structures from male breadwinner models to dual or adult worker models. I'm not as optimistic. I actually think what we're seeing with austerity is a shift back towards a modified version of the male breadwinner model, though we also know that men are being affected to a large extent by austerity, but there are clear gender distinctions. So the challenge for Europe has been to reconcile competing agenda, demographic renewal, economic competitiveness and equality. And can I just say, economic competitiveness is the driver for the single market. After all, the EU is built around what used to be, before Lisbon, the first pillar, the core of the EU itself. Everything else fits within that and is supposed to support, in a functional way, the delivery of a competitive single market. So the dominant discourse in terms of equality has been about the cost of non-equality, particularly in relations to working mothers. And the question that is yet to be answered, but it is emerging at the moment, is it still viable in the context of a shift towards higher political and economic priorities? So in terms of the evidence that has started to emerge in the UK, actually, and the Fawcett Society and the Gender Budget Group have really been leading in this particular area, highlighting the deeply gender nature of the cuts that have been proposed since 2010. Now, the Fawcett Society's case against the UK government in 2010 for failure to adhere to the gender equality duty was ultimately dismissed. But actually it has highlighted the failures of mainstreaming as a concept more widely. So in terms of the cuts, what we do know, and the data that has come out through the last couple of years, we have had increasing female unemployment rates, we've had cuts in childcare services, and what we're saying is that actually it's working mothers that are being affected the most, largely because of women's employment structures and both the vertical and horizontal segregation of the labour market, with a concentration of women within the public sector. Now, what I would therefore conclude is that austerity and the euro crisis are crystallizing this distinction between high and low politics. Equality is firmly placed at the lower end of the political spectrum, and therefore it's not a priority. And it is very much being articulated, though not explicitly, as acceptable collateral damage. This is actually supported by hegemonic gender ideologies and discourses about mothering, and the very deeply gender nature of the state itself, which actually relies on women's caring and women's mothering to make up for the shortfalls of the state itself in the area of welfare, particularly at times of economic crisis.
Thank you.